Women can't reach enlightenment, he said. Or did he? You've probably heard it before, maybe in a textbook, maybe in a debate, maybe whispered as a quiet shame inside Buddhist communities. The Buddha said women are inferior. The Buddha said women can't be fully awakened. The Buddha refused to ordain women until forced. But what if none of that is true? What if the greatest spiritual teacher in history has been misunderstood, or worse, misrepresented? I'm Silent Flame, and today we begin one of the most sensitive, controversial, and urgent journeys through the Dharma. Because the question isn't just, what did the Buddha say about women? The real question is, who got to decide what the Buddha said? The quotes that started the fire. There are a few key passages in the Pali Canon that are often quoted to show the Buddha's supposed sexism. Here's the most infamous one. A woman can never become a Buddha. The female body is not fit for enlightenment. If women enter the Sangha, the Dharma will only last 500 years. These are jarring. They sound like something from a different religion, a different time, not from the man who spoke of non-self, of universal compassion, of liberation for all beings. So where did these quotes come from? The source, Pali Canon, specifically the Vinaya Pitaka, and a few suttas from the Anguttara and Samyutta Nikayas. But here's what most people don't tell you. These lines appear in later strata of the canon, often inconsistently. They are absent from early Chinese agamas, parallel texts from the same period, and stylistically, they read very differently from the Buddha's voice in core teachings. The first nun and the heavy rules, let's talk about Mahapajapat Gotam, the Buddha's aunt and foster mother. She was the first woman to ever request full ordination from the Buddha. He refused, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and only after Ananda, his devoted male disciple, interceded on her behalf, did the Buddha relent, but with a condition. She could enter the Sangha only if she accepted 8 strict rules, called the Garudhammas. Rules like, a nun must always bow to a monk, even if he's newly ordained. Nuns can't criticize monks. A nun's ordination must be confirmed by monks. These rules sound regressive, hierarchical, sexist, but were they really from the Buddha? Modern scholarship casts serious doubt. Even ancient commentary within Theravada disputes their authenticity. Many suspect these were later additions, inserted by monastic editors after the Buddha's death to preserve male dominance, and that leads us to the next layer of the mystery. When the texts disagree with themselves, here's what's strange. In one sutta, the Buddha says women can't become Buddhas, but in another, he praises enlightened women as arahants, fully liberated. In the Theravada, one of the oldest collections of Buddhist poetry, we find the voices of awakened nuns, Kema, who teaches King Pasenadi about impermanence, Mutta, who declares freedom from household life, Soma, who answers Mara directly when he says women are too weak for wisdom. What does being a woman have to do with it? When the mind is serene, insight arises, and the body is just earth. That line alone destroys centuries of dogma. So which is it? Was the Buddha sexist? Or were later monks, trying to protect their power, the ones who shaped the narrative? And this question grows more intense when we look at the society the Buddha lived in. The world around the Buddha, let's be honest. Ancient India was not an egalitarian paradise. In the time of the Buddha, women were seen as property of fathers, then husbands. Education for women was rare. Vedic rituals excluded them, and most religions taught that birth as a woman was karmic punishment. So when the Buddha taught women directly, allowed them into monastic life, praised their insight, quoted them in scripture, he was already radically progressive for his time. In fact, no other major religious figure of that era granted women this much spiritual autonomy. So why then do parts of the canon say the opposite? That's where the real tension begins. Because in oral traditions passed down by communities of monks who had power to lose, the line between teaching and control begins to blur. Cliffhanger. Who edits the truth? If we know some quotes were likely added later, if we know the earliest teachings contradict the later ones, if we know awakened women existed and spoke for themselves, then we have to ask, who preserved the Dharma and who modified it? Did the Buddha resist female enlightenment, or did patriarchal systems resist the Buddha? And if those systems shaped the canon, what else did they change? Theravada and the burden of tradition, Theravada Buddhism, the way of the elders, often prides itself on preserving the earliest teachings of the Buddha. But that preservation comes at a cost, because while Theravada technically recognizes female arahants and even includes their verses in the Therigatha, its institutional attitude toward women has often been complicated. The Bhikkhuna lineage, broken and banned. For centuries, Theravada monastic codes did not allow for the full ordination of women, claiming the lineage had died out. And without ordained nuns to perform the ritual, no new nuns could be created. Catch 22, closed circle, religious bureaucracy disguised as doctrine. And so, in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, generations of women were blocked from the same spiritual path that the Buddha supposedly opened. They could practice, they could meditate, but they could not wear the robes, not fully. Mahayana, the rise of the sacred feminine. Centuries later, a new current emerged, Mahayana, the great vehicle. And here, something shifted. The rigid hierarchies began to soften. The voice of compassion took center stage, and into that space entered the feminine. Avalokiteshvara becomes Guanyin, the bodhisattva of compassion. Avalokiteshvara was originally male in Indian texts, but as the Dharma spread to China, the image transformed. Compassion was reimagined not as stern strength, but as gentle maternal presence. And so, Avalokiteshvara became Guanyin, the female bodhisattva who hears the cries of the world. Tara, the savior goddess. In Tibetan Mahayana, another powerful feminine figure emerged, Tara. She rides wind and fire, saves beings from suffering, embodies both wisdom and protection. She's not a nun, she's not a wife, she's not secondary. She's the embodiment of awakened activity, symbol or shift. But here's the tension. These figures are revered, but they're often mythic, not women with human bodies, not monastics with messy lives, but idealized forms of the divine feminine. So, was this liberation or another kind of pedestal? Vajrayana, Tantra, power, and paradox. Vajrayana, the tantric path, took the conversation to another dimension. Here, the feminine is not just present, she's essential. Wisdom is female by nature. In Vajrayana cosmology, compassion is masculine. Wisdom is feminine, and only their union leads to awakening. You cannot become enlightened without the feminine. Dakins, consorts, sky dancers. Tantric texts are filled with female figures, wild, wrathful, sensual, sublime. They guide male practitioners, cut through ego, embody emptiness, but they're also sometimes reduced to sexual consorts in esoteric rituals, taught almost exclusively by men. Empowerment or appropriation. Some women became powerful teachers, yes, but many were never seen as full equals. They were vessels, catalysts, muses, not always practitioners, not always subjects of devotion, but tools within it. So again, a paradox. The feminine is divine, but rarely in charge. Cliffhanger, sacred but silent. Across Buddhist history, we see a pattern. Women become symbols of compassion, wisdom, and truth. They are bodhisattvas, goddesses, embodiments of prajna. But what about real women? The ones in robes, the ones in temples, the ones with doubts and pain and awakening. Where are they in leadership, in doctrine, in decision-making? Why do the texts elevate the idea of womanhood while denying so many actual women? The awakenings that history ignored. Let's talk about the women who weren't supposed to be there, but woke up anyway. In the Therigatha, we hear their voices, women who left their homes, their children, their wealth to pursue awakening. And they didn't just meditate in silence. They taught, they debated, they challenged monks, and won. Kema, the queen turned arahant, debated King Bimbisara, outshone the Buddha's own male disciples in wisdom, directly taught monks Dhammadinna, the enlightened nun, delivered complex teachings on not-self and liberation, quoted in major discourses. Her analysis was so clear that the Buddha endorsed it publicly. Soma, the nun who silenced Mara, famously answered the demon's taunt, "Women can't reach wisdom," with this line, "The body is just earth. Insight has no gender. These aren't exceptions. They're reminders of what was always possible, but they were rarely preserved, rarely quoted, rarely translated. They were footnotes to a story they helped write. Women who taught anyway, despite restrictions, despite exclusion, despite silence. Women kept teaching. In China, the Chan masters, nuns like Miaozong, who led temples, who taught male students, who composed Dharma, poetry still studied today. In Tibet, the yogins teachers like Yeshe Tsogyal, consort of Padmasambhava, known as the mother of Tibetan Buddhism, described as fully enlightened, in her own right said to have endured extreme hardship, abuse, trials, and transcended them all in modern Thailand. Maechi teacher Upasika Ki Nanayon, not formally ordained, not part of the hierarchy, but revered as one of the most profound voices in 20th century Thai Buddhism, wrote about emptiness, mindfulness, and freedom, with clarity that humbled many monks. No robes, no seat on the council, just wisdom and silence, broken, the erasure through language. There's another kind of silencing, one that's quieter, but just as effective. Translation. When Buddhist texts moved across cultures, they were often copied by monks, interpreted by male scholars, filtered through patriarchal language, pronouns changed. Names were masculinized, feminine figures were reinterpreted as metaphors, not people. And over time, women who once spoke were made into images, from subject to symbol to silence. A nun becomes a parable, a teacher becomes an archetype, a human becomes a footnote. The feminine becomes universalized, but not personalized. She is wisdom, but not kema. She is compassion, but not soma. She is Tara, but not the nun teaching under a tree in a dusty village. Cliffhanger. Why does the system keep forgetting? So here we are. History is full of awakened women, not myths, not symbols, practitioners, teachers, real human beings. They reached arahantship, built communities, faced harassment, taught through poetry, debate, silence, and yet their names are rare, their texts are scattered, their stories are forgotten or actively removed. So the question is no longer, can women awaken? They already did. The real question is, why does the system keep forgetting them? Revival, women reclaiming ordination. For nearly 1,000 years, the Bhikkhuna Sangha, the fully ordained female monastic lineage, was dead in Theravada Buddhism. No ordinations, no recognition, no place at the table. But in the late 20th century, women began bringing it back. In Sri Lanka, 1996, a quiet revolution. A group of women traveled to South Korea. There, in the Dharmaguptaka lineage, they received full ordination returning home. They reignited a lineage long thought extinct in Thailand. Underground nuns, open-hearted teachers, women like Dhammananda, Bhikkhuni, facing legal threats, societal shame, and media attacks, but continuing to teach, ordain, and lead. Backlash came fast. Senior monks denied legitimacy. Governments blocked registration. Public temples closed their doors, but the flame had already lit. As one Thai nun said, "They told us this door was closed. We didn't knock. We built another one." Female voices in the global Sangha. Today, the Dharma is global, and so are the women who carry it. Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, UK to India, spent 12 years meditating in a Himalayan cave, founded a nunnery for education and empowerment, advocated for full ordination across all Tibetan schools. Pema Chodron, USA, Nova Scotia. One of the most widely read Buddhist teachers in the West, speaks vulnerably of heartbreak, fear, ego, has reached millions with teachings rooted in Tibetan Mahayana. Ayatathaloka, USA, scholar and forest nun, helped revive Bhikkhuna lineage in the West. known for sharp, clear interpretation of early texts, Bhikkhuna Kusuma, Sri Lanka, one of the first to be reordained after centuries, taught both monks and lay people, insisted, if the Buddha allowed it, no one today can undo it. These women aren't exceptions, they are restorers, and yet they are rarely invited to councils, rarely quoted in textbooks, rarely seen as authorities by the very systems they're healing, the ones who kept going. Let's be clear, ordination didn't solve everything. Many women who walk the path today face what monks never have to: disrespect in temples, questions about legitimacy, lack of housing, funding, robes, texts, doubts, dismissals, spiritual gaslighting, but they keep going. A Tibetan nun in exile teaches village children. A Western practitioner finds refuge in a cave, without lineage, without praise. A Southeast Asian bhikkhuna gives Dhamma talks from a forest hut. A Zen priest in California speaks of silence, rage, and stillness. In the same breath, they're not asking for status. They're doing the work. And in doing so, they're redefining what lineage means. Cliffhanger: is this still the Dharma? So now we reach attention. If women were allowed in the beginning, if they reached awakening, if the Buddha himself said yes, why do women today still have to fight for what was already granted? Why do they need to prove their worth, reclaim their texts, defend their vows? What kind of Dharma needs defending from itself? The wound of exclusion: imagine entering a temple. You bow, you sit, you breathe. But somewhere, silently, you're also carrying a question: am I allowed to be here? For centuries, women in Buddhism have carried this question not just socially, but spiritually. When silence becomes self-doubt, it's subtle. A teacher quotes only men. A text says your body is unfit. A ritual requires a monk to validate your vow. A lifetime of practice still ends in not quite equal. Even if no one says it out loud, you begin to internalize it. Maybe I'm not as pure. Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I should stay quiet. And that quiet becomes heavy, not peaceful, but silencing, transforming silence into practice. But silence has two faces: one imposed, one chosen. When silence is imposed, it crushes. But when silence is chosen, it becomes power. Stories of women who stopped explaining: a nun who was never given a title, but whose presence calmed everyone in the room. A laywoman who taught no classes, but whose death poem became a koan. A practitioner who was told to wait, so she sat and waited and found stillness beneath the waiting. The deepest Dharma doesn't shout. These women didn't fight for authority. They became authority through clarity. They didn't demand recognition. They became unignorable by disappearing into the practice itself. Meditation as refusal. Every time a woman sits to meditate in a tradition that told her she was secondary, she rewrites the story, not by protest, but by presence, the search for an authentic feminine path. But what if the real path isn't about being equal to men? What if true liberation isn't about being included in the old structure, but seeing through it? Masculine design, feminine struggle. Most Buddhist institutions were built by men for men, structured like monastic armies. Even meditation techniques, built around asceticism, discipline, detachment, suppression of emotion. But the feminine isn't weakness. It's different. It might feel first, then see soften before cutting, stay in chaos longer, speak with images, not logic, not less spiritual, just less legible to the system. A woman doesn't need to be as good as a man at the Dharma. She needs to be as honest as herself. Because liberation doesn't come from comparison, it comes from the end of comparison. Cliffhanger: if freedom requires conformity, is it freedom? So now we ask, if women can only be accepted when they meditate like men, quote texts like men, renounce like men, is that really liberation? If the structure invites them in, but only as mirrors of male ideal, what kind of freedom is that? And if the Buddha never asked anyone to conform, but the tradition now does, then the question isn't whether women can awaken, it's can they awaken in their own voice, in their own rhythm, in their own truth? The female body, battlefield or gateway. In many Buddhist texts, The female body is seen as a problem. A woman's form is a fetter. The female birth is a karmic obstacle. She must be reborn as a man to reach full Buddhahood. These aren't fringe quotes. They're canonical, repeated, echoed for centuries. But here's the question no one wants to ask. Are these teachings or cultural projections? The facts of embodiment. The female body bleeds, gives birth, feeds life, ages under different rules, is sexualized, politicized, controlled. It's not less pure, it's more visible, more uncontrollable, more feared by systems built to suppress chaos. So instead of revering the body as a temple, the tradition labeled it a distraction. Emptiness isn't disembodiment. Let's return to the heart of Buddhist insight, shunyata, emptiness. Everything is empty of inherent existence, including names, roles, genders, norms, doctrines. So what happens when a woman looks into her own body and sees emptiness, not shame, the cramps, the vulnerability, the pleasure, the breast, the blood, the bones, all seen clearly as form arising and falling, no blame, no concealment, just clear seeing, the body as a bell of truth. Instead of hiding the body to reach the Dharma, what if the body is the Dharma? This too is impermanent. This too is not mine. This too is awakening. The revolution of non-denial, a quiet revolution, is happening, not in protests, but in practice. Women and those outside gender norms are reclaiming their own experience as valid ground for liberation. A trans nun says, "My suffering is real, so is my insight." A mother says, "My kids are my koan." A survivor of assault says, "My trauma isn't impurity, it's fuel." A menstruating yogini says, "My cycle is not an obstacle, it's a mandala." The body becomes teacher, the scars become sutra, the silence becomes speech. This isn't New Age revision, it's core Dharma. All things are empty, and that includes the stories that exclude. Cliffhanger, can emptiness speak in a woman's voice? So now we arrive at the final tension. Emptiness is the absence of fixed self. But for centuries, women have been told, "You're too much body, too much emotion, too much noise." So they tried to be empty by being small, by shrinking, by suppressing, by disappearing. But what if true emptiness isn't quiet? It's truthful. It speaks through this very body, not to erase the feminine, but to embody it without apology. Beyond equality, toward truth. Let's stop asking if women can be equal to men in Buddhism, because equality assumes the male form is the standard, the male path is the path, the system is correct, just incomplete. But what if the system isn't neutral? What if equality means being absorbed into a structure that was never meant to hold your truth? Then the goal isn't equality, it's liberation from comparison. What women seek is not permission, it's freedom to be true. And truth doesn't come through conformity, it comes through clarity. Feminine awakening is not a replica. Let's be clear, enlightenment is not gendered, but the path to it often is. Not by necessity, but by history. For centuries, awakening was described in masculine metaphors, monastic ideals, texts written by men for men, and so women had to either translate themselves into that language or fall silent. But a third option is emerging: speak from where you are. Let the Dharma reshape itself around your truth. Feminine realization might look like holding paradox instead of resolving it, staying rooted in the body, leading from intuition, not hierarchy, teaching through care, not conquest, not less wise, just less familiar. Teachers who didn't adapt, they transformed Lama Tsultrim Alione, former Tibetan nun, created Feeding Your Demons, a practice rooted in feminine psychology, teaches integration, not denial. Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, Black feminist Zen priest, writes about silence, embodiment, and the politics of presence. Her Dharma includes race, gender, grief, not as distractions, but as doorways. Joan Halifax Roshi, leader in socially engaged Buddhism, works with death, dying, and compassionate action, emphasizes the feminine archetype of fierce compassion. Thanisara, former nun in Thai forest tradition, speaks on power, trauma, and the future of the Sangha. We don't need permission to awaken. We just need to remember we already can. These women didn't try to fit in. They let the Dharma flow through their actual life. What if the purest Dharma is still coming? What if the Buddhist path, as we know it, is not the final form? What if we've only heard half the Dharma for 2,500 years, and the other half, the one spoken in a different rhythm, through a different body, from a different silence, is only now beginning to be voiced, not a rejection, not a revolution, but a completion? Maybe the Buddha opened the door, and now the women are walking through it, carrying teachings the tradition wasn't ready to hear until now. Cliffhanger: is women's awakening the Dharma itself? So let's stop asking whether women are allowed to be awakened. They are, they were, they always have been. The real question is, what does it mean for Buddhism itself when women stop waiting and start speaking as Buddhas? The myth of permission. What if the greatest illusion was not that women can't awaken, but that they ever needed permission? For centuries, doors were closed, stories were erased, authority was denied, and so women waited for recognition, for inclusion, for lineage, for approval. But the Dharma was never owned, and no one needs permission to see clearly. Enlightenment isn't granted, it's realized, and realization doesn't ask for validation. The Buddha within, without gatekeepers. You do not need to be a monk. You do not need a robe. You do not need a council to say yes. The Buddha said, "Be a light unto yourself," and some lights burn from inside the wounds. A woman sitting with her breath, ignored by institutions, yet clearer than all the scriptures. A trans teacher, rejected by both gendered sanghas, embodying no self more completely than most who preach it. A girl in a war zone, breathing in pain, breathing out compassion, never heard, never cited, and yet awakened. These are not poetic exceptions. They are the Dharma, unfiltered by power. When you stop asking and simply walk, there comes a moment in every real path where you stop asking, am I allowed? Do I belong? Is this real? And instead, you walk, barefoot, breathing, burning away doubt with every step. You do not wait for the temple to open. You become the ground it will one day be built on. Some may never quote you, some may never see you, but none of that matters, because truth doesn't need echo, it needs embodiment. I'm silent flame, and if you are a woman, or anyone who's ever been told they're too impure, too emotional, too disruptive, too much, then this is for you. Not to convince, not to plead, not to wait, but to remind you, you were always the path, not because you're perfect, but because you're present. And presence burns illusion faster than scripture ever could. So if no one gave you the Dharma, take it, live it, be it, in the way only you can. And when the world still says, you're not part of this, smile and answer, I am this.